Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I will be giving you the top 10 armies of September. So for those of you who may be new to this series of videos, it's a list of armies from the Warhammer 40k tabletop game tournament scene where I talk about each army and show off the army list that topped at these events. How this list works is that the armies that had the most top 5 placings at GT and major tournaments during the month of September get a higher spot on the list, while other armies that had at least one placing get an honorable mention. If two armies have the same amount of top 5 placings, then the tiebreaker is what those placings actually were. So the army that had more first, second, or third place finishes win that tiebreaker. Also, as most of you may know, in the tabletop game of Warhammer 40k, you can mix and match certain sub-factions as long as they fall under the same main faction, such as Imperium, Eldari, and Chaos. So for lists that use multiple sub-factions, I will determine the primary faction of that list based on which sub-faction had the most points spent on it, while considering the other factions in the list as allies or secondary factions. So for example, if a list had 1200 points of Chaos Demons and 800 points of Chaos Space Marines, then I would consider that list to be a Chaos Demons list. So now that you know how the placings on this list work, let's just jump right into it. Number 10, Orcs. That's right, Orcs are 10th this month, and they seem to have dropped almost as fast in the rankings as Blizzard Entertainment's fan base have dropped supporting Blizzard. But I do think Blizzard still takes the cake on that one. Back on topic though, Orcs had 2 top 5 placings during the month of September. Continuing the trend from last month, the theme of these lists is spam smash-a-guns, alongside your usual big squads of boys with character support. Spamming grots is still a thing this month too, since they can provide a good area denial with the amount of bodies you can bring, or they can camp objectives for cheap. And they also provide bodies to jump in front of incoming shots for better units of the army with the use of the stratagem grot shields. Other than that, we have some shock attack guns, some mega knobs, and even some storm boys. So it's not looking too good for the greenskins this month compared to previous months, but the silver lining is at least they can still compete in the current meta. Number 9, Chaos Demons. The Demons of Chaos come in 9th this month with 2 top 5 placings during the month of September, with their placings being slightly better than the Orcs to beat them out for the tiebreaker. Unfortunately, I only have one list to show you guys and gals, since one of the players didn't post their list to the Best Coast Pairings app, which is where I get the tournament placements that I use in this series of videos. The one list I do have to show you though is a Jim Vessel style Chaos list, with a ton of demons backed up by Thousand Sons character support. The idea is that you use the Plague Bearers to screen for the Thousand Sons characters to allow them to cast their spells with immunity from being shot at, and eventually you charge with the characters while using the demons to still provide a screen through expert positioning. It is incredibly difficult to pilot this type of list correctly, but in the right hands, it's an amazing toolbox army that has an answer for a lot of things. With that said, it looks like these style of lists might be getting phased out of the current meta. Jim Vessel himself has even moved on to playing another style of Chaos Soup over playing this type of list. And since Jim was a big contributing factor in this army getting placed in the top 10 each month, it's now pretty much up to TJ Lanigan and other Chaos players to pull that extra weight. So it will be interesting, and I'm anxiously looking forward to future placings of Thousand Sons Chaos Demon Soups lists in the future. Number 8, Astra Military. The Imperial Guard come in 8th this month with 3 top 5 placings during the month of September. All 3 of these lists use allies of some sort. One list using Blood Angel allies while another uses an Imperial Knight, and the third list uses Caustodies with the post-nerf Caladius Grav tanks. Astra Militarum is, in my opinion, the best army to make Imperial soup with, since they complement a ton of different Imperium sub-factions very well. They have the best disposable troops choice in the game with Guardsmen, some incredibly good artillery that helps deal with stuff like units hiding out of line of sight or in magic boxes. They can be used as a command point farm or battery since their units are really cheap, and they can actually be pretty decent at being a shooting army and a close combat army, so they can fit well in either shooting armies or close combat armies. When it comes to Astra Militarum, I feel like they excel in board control due to having a ton of disposable infantry that can move insanely fast with the use of the order move move move. So they are really good at grabbing objectives and move blocking the enemy with their models. And on top of that, their units actually pack a decent punch, with stuff like tank commanders, which have become increasingly popular in the meta, Catachan infantry getting a ton of strength 4 attacks in close combat, and stuff like wyverns and basilisks that make use of the artillery formation. With all of that said, I do believe that Guard is still one of the better armies in the game, and can hold their own in a mono Guard build. And the SoCal hometown hero Brandon Grant has even shown us this in previous months. Overall, I'm happy that the Guard are still making top 10s since they are one of my favorite armies, and I love the idea of regular humans kicking ass in a universe full of Xenos threats and superhumans. Number 7, Adeptus Caustodies. The army that probably sells the most painting pots of Retributor armor comes in at number 7 this month with 3 top 5 placings during the month of September, with their placings being slightly better than the Imperial Guard to beat them out in the tiebreaker. Caustodies received some nerfs recently that nerfed the Telemon Dread and the Caladius Grav Tank. 2 of these lists, however, played either before the nerf was announced or their tournament didn't enforce the new changes because it was so close to the date of the tournament. So 2 of these lists are using the old points. One of these lists, however, played with a list post-nerf and still made use of the Caladius Grav Tanks. And as you probably saw from the Caustodies allies in one of those Imperial Guard lists, that player used post-nerf Caladius Grav Tanks as well. I think the Telemon made it out the worst by far with the nerfs, but the Caladius Grav Tanks are actually still pretty decent, and you could even make an argument that they were kind of buffed as well. Not an overall buff, but they did receive what I would consider a minor buff. Sure, it costs more points, which is a nerf. Sure, the main gun is now strength 7 instead of strength 8, which is also a nerf, but the gun being flat 2 damage instead of D3 damage means it's more consistent than what D3 used to be. So now it's the perfect unit for killing stuff like Intercessors from Space Marines or Eldari Bikes, or even stuff like Plague Bearers, since it makes them take 2 Feel No Pain saves for each of their failed saves. So I think the role of the Caladius Grav Tank changed a tiny bit to be a heavy infantry killer while still being decent against most vehicles, instead of just being good at killing everything. Number 6. Imperial Knights. The Mechanical Titans of the Imperium come in number 6 this month with 4 top 5 placings during the month of September. Imperial Knights are not nearly as popular as they once were, and more lists are finding ways to deal with Knights more efficiently. Almost every top list nowadays can either one-shot a Knight, or they have ways to win the matchup, which is usually with board control. I still feel like Imperial Knights are a gatekeeper army. They are strong against average or lower skilled players that have suboptimal lists, but not that great against top tier players who have insanely optimized lists. With that said, we can't really deny that Knights are a very strong army. They have been consistently getting top 5 placings for over a year now. And in the right hands of a skilled player, they can still be a force to be reckoned with. Being able to rotate Ion Shields and also give Ion Bulwark to another Knight so you have 4-up invulnerable saves makes them incredibly durable. Also, with the stratagem to be able to have them act at full bracket even when they're not, that's incredibly strong as well. So they can be shooting at top bracket until you kill them essentially. Or at least one of the Knights can do that if they're in a multiple Knight list. Overall though, I do think Knights are still good for the meta because they force people to build a list in a certain way instead of just spamming a ton of anti-infantry, which is what we kind of saw before Knights actually made an appearance in the meta. Number 5. Genestealer Cults. The Forces of the Hive Mind come in number 5 this month with 4 top 5 placings during the month of September, with their placings being slightly better than Imperial Knights to win the tiebreaker. In the most recent big FAQ, Genestealer Cult received some nerfs, such as being stuck to the same restrictions for Deep Strike as every other army in the game. But I assume some of, if not all of these lists didn't have to play with those new restrictions because, well, they were so recent and most tournament organizers don't force changes that close to their event. With that said, even with the changes, I think Genestealer Cult can still be an incredibly strong army in the right hands. But I could see some top players who aren't necessarily dedicated to the army dropping the army in favor for the new hotness or flavor of the month. But also with that said, there was recently an event that implemented these new restrictions for the army before the FAQ dropped, and I believe it was Nick Rose who was still able to do incredibly well in that event even with the restrictions. So it goes to show that in the right hands, the army can still perform incredibly well even post-nerf. Number 4. Drukhari. My favorite competitive faction in the game comes in 4th this month with 5 top 5 placings during the month of September. Cabals and Covens are the most popular this month, using mainly Blackheart and Prophets of Flesh. One list does, however, use a Witch Cult alongside a Cabal, but the other lists focus on either just Cabals or a Cabal plus a Coven. One interesting thing about these lists, though, is that a few of them actually brought some Harlequin allies, which isn't really unheard of, but it just hasn't been seen a lot recently. Even I myself have been toying around with bringing a Harlequin detachment with a big unit of Haywire jet bikes in order to help deal with the quote-unquote unkillable Leviathan Iron Hands dread. But I don't think that's the reason that these guys brought them, since, well, Iron Hands was still very new, and I assume most tournaments in September weren't using their rules yet due to them being released so close to the event. And also because 2 of these lists didn't include any jet bikes. They just included some Death Jesters, a Solitaire, and a Shadowseer. So I assume they bring this detachment because it's fairly cheap, plus it gives some sort of psychic phase and potential psychic denial. The Solitaire, which is probably one of the top 3 units in the Harlequin books due to being insanely fast, hard-hitting, and deceptively durable, so he's just a good take on his own. And they probably take the Death Jesters because, well, they're cheap, so they can finish off the Vanguard detachment pretty easily, but they actually synergize pretty well with the Phantasm grenade launchers that Drukhari can bring, because they can force the opponent to have to spend 2 command points every turn to make a unit morale immune. And if they don't, then they're going to lose some models to morale, and because of one of the Death Jester's abilities, you can actually pick which model flees from your opponent's unit. So it's a great way to pick off that one model that has a special or heavy weapon without having to kill all of the chaff infantry before you can get to it. Overall though, I'm happy to see my beloved Drukhari still doing well in the tournament scene. And now, the top 3 armies of September. Number 3, Craft Worlds. The Eldar have fallen from 1st to 3rd this month, with only 5 top 5 placings during the month of September, with those placings being better than Drukhari's to win the tiebreaker. Flyer spam is back this month, with most of these lists using 4+ flyers. And they're either all Craft World flyers, or they mix in some Drukhari flyers to gain access to the Agents of X stratagem, which is the I cancel your stratagem. I think we were all surprised when the new FAQ didn't really do anything to stop flyer spam. I think we were all assuming something would be done to change it, but nothing has changed, so I think it's safe to say that flyer spam will live on for a bit unless the meta changes enough that they aren't as viable anymore. With that said though, I think this is already happening, but at a very slow pace, since it seems as though Games Workshop has recognized that flyer spam is a thing, and they are making counters to it as they release new rules. For example, it started with the relic for Chaos Knights that can make a knight ignore modifiers, and then with Chaos Space Marines and Space Marines with the way their rerolls work now, and that they can reroll any dice despite modifiers. Also with Chaos Space Marines and Space Marines, there's multiple ways to give them +1 to hit now to make modifiers not that bad. So I do think Games Workshop is addressing flyer spam and negative to hit modifiers, but it's at a very slow rate that I think will take place over time with new codexes and rules. Personally though, controversial opinion, I actually kinda like flyer spam. We don't really see many flyers in the game except randomly here or there, so I think it's cool that an army actually makes use out of a lot of flyers. I think it keeps the meta interesting, especially because when you build your list for competitive, you have to keep in mind that you need a way to deal with these flyers, whether it be by being able to reliably kill them or just by being able to kill everything else and control the board. It's kind of like Imperial Knights in that regard, and it's the same reason why I like that army as well. And to be fair, Craft Worlds don't really need to spam flyers in order to be viable. I think the army can definitely hold its own if you only include a couple flyers in the list. They have a ton of good units and combos in their codex. I just think flyer spam is the flavor of the month, or I guess flavor of the last few months. I think it's the whole part of the mindset of if it isn't broke, don't fix it. And that's essentially what's happening right now, is that it has been shown that flyer spam does work in the meta. So there's really no reason for anyone to get creative and try something different, other than if they just want to be creative and try something different. But if your goal is to win an event, then why not use what you know will work and what has been proven to work multiple times? So I think we're kind of stuck in that rut, and as you'll see with the next army, it's pretty much the same thing. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. And that's how I think a lot of competitive players treat building army lists. Number 2, Tau Empire. Gundam Wing comes in number 2 this month with 6 top 5 placings during the month of September. I've been saying it for a long time, but I do still believe that Tau is one of the strongest armies in the game when built right and played right. And although I would love to play the army myself, I ended up looking up the price of the build that I want, and well, that's gonna have to wait for a while. Anyways, the builds this time around seem to be mostly Triptide lists with a few variations. Devon Swan's Seeker Missile spam list, a Supremacy Suit list, and a list that combines elements from Triptide and Seeker Missile spam. So kind of like the Eldar that we just previously talked about, it seems that Tau have honed their list very well. The Triptides are strong due to the Savior Protocol mechanic, where the drones can eat shots for the giant suits, and the Seeker Missiles are really good since you only have to rely on a few marker lights to get the damage out that you need. Also, both types of lists have some amazing shooting potential that can sometimes easily table opponents in just a few turns, and then they can take control of the board once the greater good has been imposed on the enemy. The fact that it's really only these 2 list variations that are winning though isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of armies kinda get stuck with only having a couple of known viable builds. Look at Necrons for example, who are stuck with Immortals, triple Doomsday Arcs, and triple Doom Scythes. Or Death Guard a long time ago when they were still viable, they were stuck with Forge World Dreadnought spam and with Plague Burst Crawlers. Or Chaos Space Marines currently with their Purge Dreadnoughts and Flawless Host Disco Lords. The silver lining in this though is that at least the army has some sort of viable build. Some armies in the game don't really have any viable build, at least that we know of. With that said, I do think that these aren't necessarily the only viable builds to win a tournament with Tau. I just think that, like I said previously, most players tend to stick to what they know what works and what is known to work. But for a good example of people breaking up the mold, Devon Swan a few months ago surprised us all with his Seeker Missile spam list when most of us thought that Triptides were the only way to play the army, at least at a competitive level. So who knows, there might even be some hidden gems that no one has discovered yet. We'll just have to wait and see. And now before we get into the top army of September, let's go over some honorable mentions. These armies had at least one top 5 placing during the month of September, or had multiple placings but lost out on tiebreakers due to their placings not being as good as the Orcs. So for this month we have Chaos Knights with 1 placing, Tyranids with 2 placings, Chaos Space Marines with 2 placings, Dark Angels with 1 placing, Necrons with 2 placings, Admech with 2 placings, Sisters of Battle with 1 placing, Space Wolves with 1 placing, Harlequins with 1 placing, and Death Guard with 1 placing. And since I know some of you are going to ask about the list, here's the Sisters of Battle list. That's a lot of Meltagons. And now for the top army of September. I think you were all expecting it. Number 1, Space Marines. The Sons of the Primarchs come in at number 1 this month. They dominated the competition with 13 top 5 placings during the month of September, so I think it's safe to say that their codex turned out to be pretty good. Quick interruption from Future Brady. The script for this video was written and recorded a couple of weeks ago, and I only finished editing yesterday. I just wanted to add this part into the video to say to keep in mind that September was pretty much all about Ultramarines and White Scars. So everything you're about to hear in the next part of this video is in relation to those 2 chapters of the Space Marine Codex. Iron Hands wasn't really a thing in the meta until October, and I'm definitely aware of how strong they are, or I guess were before their FAQ nerf. So please keep that in mind when listening to what I have to say about Space Marines in the next segment. Now back to the original content. But before some of you jump the gun and start claiming that the army is OP, I'm not going to say that they're not OP, because they very well might be. I just think we actually have to analyze this situation and try to figure out if the book is just really strong and one of the better books in the game, or if it's overly strong. And in order to do this, I think we need to consider a few factors first. First off, this is the first month after the release of the Codex where we had a full month where the rules were in place. This means the hype for the army is through the roof, since it's Space Marines, who are pretty much the face of Warhammer 40k, and a ton of people want to play the army since their rules are actually good this time around. Second, I think it's safe to say that Space Marines are the most popular faction in the game, especially when you consider that they have some of the most popular sub-factions like Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, and when combined with the hype that was generated, this probably means there was a ton of Space Marine players at these events. For example, according to Pete, who is one of the guys who runs 40kstats.com, in the 4 weeks after the Codex was released, Space Marines jumped up to take up 13% of the meta, and they only had a 52% win rate in those 4 weeks. There could have also been a ton of really skilled players that picked up the army because of the hype, which led to the extremely good showing this month. And third, because the army is so new, people need time to learn how to play against the army. And because most people can't practice every day or even every other day, and some people don't have access to playing against certain armies or certain lists, there's probably a lot of players out there who played against Space Marines for the first time at these events. So there was probably a bit of a surprise factor that went into their dominant performance, since a lot of people could have underestimated what Space Marines are capable of because we're used to them not being that great. For some more stats about Space Marines, Val from 40kstats.com was also nice enough to send me a chart showing the Space Marines' performance during the entire month of September, and it showed that Space Marines are actually performing exceptionally well in relation to how many people are playing them. But he also agreed that their extreme performance could be due to some of, if not all of the factors that I mentioned previously, and that we will have to wait and see what the future holds to truly know if Space Marines are a bit too strong or if they're just shaking up the meta. So anyways, I figured I'd just throw that out there since I think those are definitely factors that should be considered. Let's talk about the lists a bit before I close this video. 5 of the lists were Ultramarines, 3 of the lists were White Scars, 1 list was an Imperial Fist list, and 4 of them were Successor Chapter lists. It would seem as though that the most popular units are Whirlwinds, Thunderfire Cannons, Repulsor Executioners, Leviathan Dreads, Eliminators, and Tactical Warsuits. Some of these lists are infantry based, while a few of them are more mech based. Some lists included named characters like Guilliman and Calgar, while others used generic characters and buffed them up with relics like the Vox thing that gives their auras an extra 3 inches. I actually think it's really cool that Space Marines now kind of fit their identity of being a jack of all trades, because they are a jack of all trades and always have been. It's just previously they kind of weren't good at any of the stuff that they did. Now they're actually pretty good at everything, but not necessarily the best at everything that they do. They are a pretty heavily armored army, so they're harder to kill. They shoot really well, they do combat really well, and they're pretty mobile. They have the whole package for the most part. They also have a lot of utility now, with access to a ton of stratagems. Stuff like redeploying units after you see who goes first, shooting Overwatch with multiple units, making units more durable with stuff like transhuman physiology or the Dreadnought strat to have damage, and much more. So overall, I'm actually happy that the face of 40k is now an army that is to be contended with. And I'm also looking forward to see how armies like Iron Hands do in the next month's top 10. And that's going to be it for this video. Let me know what you guys and gals think of this month's top 10 and also your thoughts on the new Space Marines. I always read every comment on my videos, so I'd love to know your thoughts. Also, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button since it does help out the video with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're not already subscribed but enjoy this type of content, then feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon to be notified when I make new videos. Also, like I said earlier, don't forget to check out the channel's Patreon page if you want to help contribute more to the channel and help me expand and bring more and better content, or if you want to benefit from any of the awards I provide. Also, don't forget to check out the channel sponsor, Bearbox Studios, if you need some painting commissions work done. He does a great job and I've been happy with everything he's worked on for me. You can find his link in the description. And like I said earlier, I honestly can't say it enough. Thanks to all my current patrons. Without you guys and gals, I really couldn't do this without you. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And with that said, that's the end of this video, and I guess I will see you all in the next one. Happy wargaming.